And now for my next number, I'd like to return to the
classic.
Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Hey gang, like the intro said, I'm going to take a minute and go back to the classics. My way of paying homage to those who came before me. I heard these stories long ago, and they've always stuck with me. I know once in a while I drop in some of the classics into my regular podcasts, but I thought I would spend an entire one doing some of my favorites. Hope you enjoy my take on some of the classics. A Drink of Water by D.B. Cooper Pooper Scooper. The story takes place in America in the early 1980s, before my mom was married. At the time, she lived with her sister's husband, and their 3 dogs. My mother's family is from Ireland, and so is my aunt's husband. His sister, Mary Catherine, was visiting the States for a few weeks, and during the daytime everyone worked, so it was just Mary Catherine at home with their 3 dogs. Princess, a German Shepherd Standard Collie mix, Kelly, a German Shepherd Husky, and Mickey, a massive illegal wolf mix. All 3 dogs were big hams, but fiercely protective. One day, my mom came home from work to find the lights turned off, shades drawn, and the doors locked. She thought maybe Mary Catherine had gone for a walk, but when she opened the door, she met Mary standing white as a sheet with a knife in her hand. She said to my mom, "Something terrible happened today. We had a visitor around noon." At that time, Mary was in the kitchen fixing herself some lunch when she heard the front door open. The dogs went crazy howling and barking, and the dogs never barked up family, so she went to see who it was. It was a man she had never seen before who had let himself in through the unlocked door and was sitting on the couch. One dog stood on the staircase landing adjacent to the couch and refused to go near him. Before she could ask who he was, he said, "I'm very thirsty. Could you get me a drink of water?" Mary Catherine figured he was just a neighbor, or maybe this guy's car had broken down, and the house was situated in a remote and relatively safe area, so she didn't think of him as a threat. Plus, she was from a small village in Ireland where she knew everyone, and unexpected guests were the norm for her. This guy sat on the sofa so casually, like he was waiting for someone, so she gave him an awkward hello and went into the kitchen to get him a drink, ushering the dogs in with her to avoid making a fuss. The dogs were very angry and growling at the man with their hackles raised, but they hadn't approached him. She had her back turned at the kitchen sink filling up a glass of water, when she felt a hand clap on her shoulder. "Are you waiting on someone?" Mary said nervously. "The family won't be home for a while." "I know they won't," the man replied coldly. Mary whipped around to face the man. He said, "You know, you're a good-looking woman, and I'm a good-looking man." The dogs had now backed up against Mary Catherine, barking and howling at the man. She reached behind her to grab a knife off the knife block in one hand and the glass of water in the other held out to him. "I think you should drink your water and be on your way," she said. The man stood and drank the water while Mary Catherine stood there with the dogs. She watched him place the glass on a table, open the door, go down the steps, and walk into the street until she lost sight of him. Once everyone was home, my mother called the police. But there wasn't much they could do since Mary Catherine wasn't hurt, and they hadn't heard any reports of break-ins or assaults, so they just took a statement. My family always tells us a story as an example of how the Irish people tend to downplay unfortunate situations, almost humorously. The Irish comedian Tommy Tiernan calls this a fundamental darkness that the Irish people have. Now we all laugh at the blackness in life, but it left a lot of questions unanswered. Had that man been watching the house to know everyone's schedule? To know that Mary Catherine wasn't from around here, and was going to use that to take advantage of her? Or was he just a wandering creep looking for unlocked doors? Walk in the Woods by Creepy Pee-Pee. My wife and I are outdoorsy people. Our first date was a picnic in the middle of the woods, and our wedding was in my parents' backyard, which is almost surrounded by forest. This matters because this story begins and ends in a forest. Late summer of 2014, it was one of those moist kinds of summer days. My lady and I went on a weekly stroll or hike through a forest near our home. About 3/4 of the way through, she noticed a pile of hair, wire-like hair. Of course, we didn't touch it, but we didn't know what to do. It was clearly hair from a person's head, not an animal or anything else. But other than that, we didn't think much of it. The next week we went back, but this time the hair was gone, and in its place was a letter. Clearly, it had just been placed there as if someone was waiting for us. The letter read, "Why did you ignore me?" I told my wife it was just trash, but obviously she didn't believe me. It was early summer of 2015, and nothing had happened ever since. I wish it would have stayed that way. We walked around the same area that we made our discovery. We never really talked about it, and if it did come up, we would joke about it, saying that Brittany was at it again or something. Anyway, at this time, my wife was about 4.5 months pregnant, so we just took an easier path to walk. About halfway through one of these walks, I heard a whimper to my right. I looked, and there was this woman, in her early 40s. She was dirty, as if she had rolled in dirt for days. She was holding on to a tree, digging her mostly broken fingernails into the bark. I took my wife's arm and led her behind myself, and I asked, "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need me to call someone for you?" She replied, but I couldn't make out what she said. "Pardon? Why? She started vomiting what looked like black mud." I motioned my wife to start walking away while I stayed back to make sure she didn't follow or chase us. My wife didn't hesitate to start walking off. Knowing she was pregnant was most likely the reason, but when the woman noticed my wife walking away, she charged at us. Unknowing of this woman's strength, I didn't prepare to be pushed down. I fell onto my back, and next thing I knew, she was on top of me. She tried to scramble up while staring in the direction my wife was now running in. I tightly wrapped my arms around this woman, and she started vomiting onto my forehead. She tried screaming, but she would just choke. And once she had finished, she screamed, "Why did you ignore me?" I was too engaged in the idea of how the fuck I was going to get out of this. I started to wiggle to try to get myself on top of her, but once I did, what next? Stand up, shake hands, and leave? No. My face was right on her upper chest, so I couldn't just whip my face into hers. I got my arms out from under her, and I used them to hold her arms down, and I lifted myself almost like a push-up. Then I pressed my foot-filled boot onto her stomach, and mentally counted to 5. Then I accidentally kicked her chin with my other foot-filled boot, and then I took off. I looked back at her. She was gripping her jaw and reaching for me while screaming. It's amazing how fast a person can run when they feel like they could die. I dodged every rock and tree. I even went off the trail just in case she ever got up and ran for me. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I met the edge of the forest and the side of the road. Our town is half a forest, so I looked to the right, no wife to be seen. I ran to her car and she wasn't anywhere to be found. I leapt into the driver's seat and started screaming and pulling at my face, punching the steering wheel and stomping my feet. Then I heard crying and screaming in the back, and it was the love of my life laying on the seats, holding her ears and knees to her chest, or as close as they could get. I pulled myself back there so fast. I don't even remember how I did it, but I hugged her so freaking tight she smacked me off because of the vomit on my head. We didn't call the police because this experience caused my wife a lot of stress and sleepless nights. She had a miscarriage, and we chose to forget the whole thing. We don't go on walks that aren't by roads or buildings anymore. It's been 5 years since then, and we have 2 beautiful boys. We never saw that woman again, and I hope we never do. Always check under your bed by Atticor. This happened to a friend of mine. She told me about it a year or so ago. I'll call her Minji. Minji was in her late 20s and was working as an English tutor in South Korea. One evening, she was tutoring a high school boy, and they were up studying pretty late, and the buses were no longer running. Being a long way from his house, the boy asked if he could crash on her floor overnight and get the first bus the next morning. Minji was very reluctant because inviting a teenage male student to spend the night didn't sound like a great idea, but he had no other way of getting home and was begging her, and eventually she relented. They went back to her one-room apartment and she got into bed while he laid a blanket out on the floor and they both fell asleep. A few hours later, around 2 a.m., the boy woke Minji up. "I'm really hungry," he said. "Let's go get some food." Minji opened her eyes and looked at him in disbelief. "Food? Now? It's 2 a.m. Go back to bed." The student insisted. "No, I'm so hungry. Let's go get something to eat now." Minji told him that there was some ramen in the kitchen and he could fix it himself. But that didn't satisfy him. He didn't want ramen. "There's a 24-hour place just down the road," he said. "Let's go there." Eventually, after several minutes of persuasion, the boy got Minji to get up and go with him to the restaurant. They left the apartment and headed out, and as soon as they were on the street, the boy turned to Minji and said, "I'm not hungry. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked under your bed. There's a man sleeping there." They called the police and discovered that a homeless man had been living in Minji's apartment, sleeping under her bed, and he'd been there for over 2 months. The boy only saw him because he was lying on the floor and had a clear view under the bed. The police came and arrested the man, and thankfully there were no other issues. But that's by far the creepiest thing that's ever happened to anyone I know. The Ouija Board by Ruby M. I've always been into paranormal stuff, ghosts and whatnot. When this happened to me, it took place on the week of Halloween in 2014. I remember being on a group call where we were discussing the paranormal and creepy, and this guy brought the Ouija board into the topic. Somehow, someone dared me to set up a Ouija board and do it live with them. At first, I wasn't really willing to do it, because I'm easily spooked and I was all alone at home. But peer pressure kind of took over, and that's when I agreed to do it. So we read about the do's and don'ts while I was setting up the board. I lit some candles, turned my camera so they could see what was going on, and I turned off all the lights. It was pitch black in my room, and I could already feel that what I was doing was a mistake. Anyways, I started the seance, and mind you, I was very tired because it was early in the morning or late at night, and that was also something that wasn't really advised whenever using a Ouija board. I asked simple questions to begin with, and nothing happened. Then came the moment where I asked the name of the spirit, and that's where stuff started going south. The planchette started to move on its own, so naturally I freaked out, and so did everyone on the call. The planchette went to P, then A, and ended up at Z. It then stopped and made its way up to the right top corner, and then the top left corner, then the bottom left corner, and finally the bottom right corner. According to whatever we had read prior to the session, whenever the planchette does that, it means that the spirit is evil and is actually trying to escape. That's when I decided to stop the seance because at that point I was really freaked out, and so were my friends. I managed to end it, but right after, I froze. I couldn't move, and I was focused on this white orb glowy thing in front of me. I could feel that I was bawling my eyes out, but I still couldn't move, and my friends were yelling at me, asking if I was okay. Without getting an answer from me, after a few minutes the orb glowy thing disappeared. I regained consciousness and let my friends know that I was fine. We then talked about what had happened, and someone tried to search for the name Paz. It turned out it was the name of a demon entity called Pazu, at least that's what we gathered from the research. After that, I ended the call and tried to get some rest and recover from what had just happened. The next day, one of my friends told me that her psychic medium friend came to visit her, and the first thing she mentioned was the seance we did the night before. That was without my friend telling her anything about it. Her friend said that it was indeed a good call to end the seance, and that the spirit was trying to get out, and whatever it was no good. A year later, it was the week of Halloween, 1 year from when we had played with the board. At that point, I was no longer speaking to my friends because life happened. But anyway, throughout that whole week, I could feel something around me. Stuff would fall down without me touching them, and a lot of other stuff like that. I'm usually able to tell whenever a spirit or something paranormal is around me, but this time, it didn't feel right or good like it usually did. I kind of assumed it was connected to what had happened the year before, so I decided to contact one of the girls who was with me that night. She told me that she felt the same way, and stuff was happening to her, too. But it really was the scariest paranormal encounter I've ever had. I wouldn't advise anyone to mess around with a Ouija board. Night Drive in Northeast Pennsylvania by Alex M777. It was early November, a cold and rainy night around midnight. My fiancée and I like taking spontaneous late-night drives, and we typically start out on one of the main roads within our city and keep following it until we hit the next town. Sometimes these drives last hours. The layout of my county and the surrounding counties is a little bizarre. All of the cities and towns are isolated by large spreads of woods. I live in a relatively large college town, but a half-hour drive in one direction can land you stranded on jagged, unmarked gravel roads in the middle of nowhere, or in small, weird villages that no one knows about. It's actually pretty exciting, and that's why we do it so much. So, it was midnight, and we were nearly lost. Willa, my fiancée, was poking around on my phone trying to figure out what road we were on. We were on a mud path in a pit of country. It was framed by small towns that we'd never heard of. Flory, Winka, and Tell, or something like that. There were no other cars on the road. It was rainy and misty, and the headlights on my car weren't doing a damn thing. There were stands of trees and brush on either side of the road, and we were heading north. Willa told me that she thought we were going to cross 200th Street West, which runs into Rye Road, which is a straight shot to Winka. We made our way down the mud road for half an hour and never hit that other road. We'd always had fun on these sorts of drives, but this was really the first time we'd ever been on edge. Willa said that we should have found 200th Street West already, and asked me if we had passed it without noticing. I asked nervously if we should turn around, but she didn't think we could without backing up into a tree or a ditch. I was driving a Mazda, and it had an awfully wide turn radius. Willa was biting her nails while scrolling around on Google Maps, and 10 minutes passed, and we finally found a little black road snaking up a hill branching off the road we were on. I hurriedly turned onto it. It was very narrow, and twigs and branches were raking the doors and windows of the car. When we completed the climb up the little road, we found ourselves in a wide, paved clearing with a house at the back of it, tucked into the thick woods. Willa didn't miss a beat and started hissing for me to turn around. Our headlights illuminated the whole property, which was in a state of major disrepair, with no lights, windows shattered, siding and shingles shredded, and the yard littered with scraps and trash barrels, car parts, tools, hundreds of glass bottles, branches, slabs of concrete rocks, and a nasty old Chevy pickup. It looked like the house was sitting on top of all of that, every inch of the property entangled in nets of ivy and weeds. Willa pointed out little moving shadows and glowing spots around the yard. There were dozens of cats around, and they were all looking at us, their eyes glimmering from the headlights. I almost pissed myself when a walnut-sized rock darted out of the brush and popped against the windshield. It fractured the glass, and Willis screamed. She grabbed my arm and whimpered, "Denny, what was that? Oh my God, Den, what happened?" The rain was now pouring in black streams down the trees over the house, and as I looked across the pavement, all of the blood ran from my face. An immense figure stumbled out from the bushes and weeds. This guy was carrying a shovel. He was wearing a big, dirty navy coat and had a beard. Then, a screen door on the house opened and all the cats scattered. A tall, thin, spidery woman crawled out onto the porch. She had long, wild gray hair, and she was up just high enough on the porch that the headlights didn't reach her eyes. I saw her wipe her unusually dark hands on her skirt. I have no clue what was on her hands, but what I remember the most was how dark her hands were. She stared at us. Willow was screaming and crying, slapping the door lock repeatedly. I threw the car into reverse, rolling over cinder blocks and branches, and screeched back down the road. After Willis stopped crying, and there was some distance between us and the house, I started to relax. But when we got out of the woods and hit a long, straight stretch of road, I noticed headlights behind us. My stomach turned when I noticed the car behind us was mimicking all of our turns onto different roads. After nearly half an hour of being pursued, we finally reached the town of Flory and pulled into a gas station that was being visited by a few other people. I watched the vehicle that was behind us pass us. It was the same nasty Chevy truck we saw at the house. They had stalked us all the way to this town. We waited until we saw the truck disappear down the road before we got out of our car, got some food, and then asked for directions for our way home. On our way back, I looked at the rearview mirror more than I did at the road ahead. When we got back early in the morning, my teeth didn't stop chattering until I fell asleep. Parents and Ted Bundy by 6 Pints a Second. It was around Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories one year. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling the story all the time since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. Her parents had spent a nice, if awkward, first date, and around the time they would have said goodnight, the male in the situation, my friend's dad, suggested that they go for a midnight hike in Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in the area. So the two drove up the mountains of the canyon, got out of their cars, and started hiking under just the light of the stars. It was a new moon, very dark, and at some point the male started getting a bad feeling since the pathway ahead would pass under some trees. It would get even darker, because it was getting quite late. He ignored the feeling and pressed on. In later tellings of the story, my friend would say that her mom had the same feeling as her dad at what was probably the same time, though she didn't know the trail like he did. A minute later, the feeling came back to her dad. He ignored it again and started walking a bit into the trees, when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. Because they were under the trees and the new moon, it was too dark to see what the soft thing was, but the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of looking to see what his foot had bumped into, her dad and her mom both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after being married for some time, they were watching an interview on TV with serial killer Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the time he felt closest to being caught, he talked about a night he had lured a girl into Provo Canyon, and he had just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in the trees just in time, only to watch some guy walk right into the body, and for some reason, just turn around and walk away. Message on the Machine by Tragedy X. When I was 19, I was deployed to Iraq. My unit worked with bombs, and honestly, I don't know how I made it home intact. About halfway through my tour, the Red Cross notified my unit that my father was terminally ill. Within a week, I was on a plane back to the States. Now, my dad being ill was something I had grown used to. He was strong, though, and I never expected to actually lose him. I lost my mom when I was 7, and my father's lungs had collapsed shortly before then. He was on oxygen and needed a wheelchair to go anywhere, and he needed medication by the handful every few hours. He gained weight from limited movement and developed diabetes and had already beaten cancer once. I never expected to lose him. He fought through all of it, and he wasn't the type to ever give up. I arrived home and headed to the hospital. There he assured me that he was fine and everyone was overreacting. I visited him every day I was there, but he told me that he'll be fine by the time I got home for good. I reluctantly went back overseas, and I called the hospital whenever I had a few minutes of free time and we were near a call center. My deployment finished, and my dad kept his promise. He had gone home from the hospital because he said he didn't want to die there. But he got worse and had to go back. The family was all visiting, but we knew he wasn't improving. One day, I was at home and the phone rang. It was an unknown number, so I didn't answer it. It went to the answering machine, and when that picked up, a very raspy voice mumbled, "Call the hospital." It was my dad. I grabbed the phone, but he had already hung up, so I called the hospital. They told me that he'd been intubated for the past couple of hours and was starting to go into cardiac arrest. They said he was non-responsive, and everyone needed to come to say their goodbyes. I started arguing with them that he had just called me, and the nurse I was speaking to said that that wasn't possible. They'd been working on him for some time. I hung up and then told my family the news. My sister and I stared at the answering machine. We played the tape again and again. That was the last time I heard my father's voice. I'm a skeptic. I don't believe in the paranormal or ghosts, but I can't come up with any logical explanation for that answering machine. I still get watery eyes thinking about it. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or my podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Please take a minute and like this video. If you haven't, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. I'd love to know your take on these stories. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Follow me on social media. There's links to that in the description of this video. And if you'd like to take your support a little bit further, there's a link to my Patreon page, as well as a link to my storefront at tpublic.com. Get yourself some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. Hope you enjoyed these classics. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.